Hello and welcome to ISPI SoCal. This particular group of webinars that we do are all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this is our Connecting Performance Improvement to Diversity series. We are very excited today to have Crystal Kadakia, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and then we're going to swing very quickly back over to her. So she is a two-time TED Talk speaker, organizational development consultant, and author known for asking questions such as, what is possible with different? And without further ado, I am going to hand the ball back over to Crystal. Crystal?
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here with you all and excited that you all are joining today on a Friday at noon, noon my time, probably multiple times for you all, to talk about where DEI and learning intersect. As I just mentioned for a moment, I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm currently calling in from around Boone, North Carolina, for anyone who might know where that is. And as Renee so nicely mentioned, a couple of things about me. I'm very much focused on organization development. I started my career back as a chemical engineer who actually got very attracted to the field of people in general and found my way through an L&D role to OD and have kind of continued my journey since then, now as an independent consultant. I think it's been almost 9 years now that I've been doing my own consulting practice and focusing on thinking through a lot of issues related to future of work. Specifically, I'm really passionate about thinking about workplace culture and how that is transitioning as we move from kind of the industrial age and where we were at there to where we are now, with everything being digital really permeating our lives. And as Renee mentioned, a big question I often ask is, what is possible with different? You'll hear this sort of themes of this come up throughout this talk, because for me, it's really important to not just be afraid of change, but think about what it can offer us. And that's similar to how I feel about the digital age. Is there's a lot of scary transition in trying to adopt technology and figure out all of the different impacts, but there's also a lot of possibilities. And I see a lot of possibilities in the space of DEI and L&D. And that intersection is what I hope to share with you all today. So just to start with a few disclaimers in this talk. Be aware of the following possibilities for imperfections from me that might differ from your norms. When we talk about DEI concepts, when we talk about L&D, when we talk about OD, basically when we talk about anything, we all form a language around it. And some of that language is standard and everyone should know it. And sometimes we might fall from grace and not quite be there. So think about how you're practicing inclusion as you're even listening to this, because there might be misalignments in language, different interpretations of history, of both L&D and DEI that I have, or challenges from what you might be aware of in your field of view, differences in experiences we have, differences in what makes me feel confident saying something and feeling like, okay, this is a valid perspective to bring, and what you might consider valid. We all come from different places in what makes us buy into a perspective. And something I often like to say, two things. One is that truth is up to the beholder, right? We all have our own version of the truth. And two, I feel like imperfection often is, or perfection is often the enemy of inclusion. So just a few disclaimers as we start, and really opening up your mind to listening for what feels meaningful and what connects to you, and putting your own language or your own interpretations on top of what I'm saying, I think always helps really kind of stretch your muscles and take in concepts in a different way. So let me just start by sharing a little bit about the journey organizations take around diversity, equity, inclusion, and then talk a little bit about the L&D component of that. So again, this is probably an oversimplification, and it's intended to just help provide some context and some organization really around how we approach diversity journeys, how we approach equity, how we approach inclusion. And I want to, before I kind of talk in detail about that, one of the things I've noticed organizations do, and you might all have come across this as well, is confuse diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those are all really distinct concepts. They each have distinct goals and therefore require distinct strategies. So what I'm sharing here on this picture is really focused more on the diversity component. And this is where I've often experienced organizations start their journey. And they'll start out, they'll be thinking about, we really want to increase diversity. And in that very beginning stages, when I've encountered organizations that aren't as diverse, some of the things they might be doing is hiring and promoting who they know, who's easier to access for them, and maybe who has met minimum gates that might be inequitable. Like, for example, I only recruit from XYZ universities. Okay, now you've got kind of a pool. So as they start to open up and think about, hey, maybe there's something different we need to do here. We need to really invite differences into our organization. And a lot of times I start hearing that come from this desire to align or match the diversity they're seeing in their client base with their employee diversity. So everything connects back to a business need when they're first starting on this journey. And they look for, hey, how can we increase employee diversity at all levels? As they keep on getting more advanced, we start to see employee resource groups start. We start to see support for the diversity that's been invited into an organization. We might see some notions of, okay, we've invited the diversity in, but how do we now make people feel more included and like they belong here, right? And so that's where we start to move into inclusion. And as I've watched this arc for organizations, I noticed some really great things. With diversity, I've noticed folks really inviting differences in and then having kind of what I often boil down to is the diversity scorecard of recruiting and promoting and where are we at each level. When we get to inclusion, folks start to realize, wow, this is something different. This isn't necessarily about the scorecard, but it's about how people are feeling day to day and how they're treating one another in a day-to-day behavior, a day-to-day capability. And so we start to recognize a difficulty around a top-down approach. And I'm very much in the mindset that inclusion is about every person in an organization. And so we really start to focus on that person-to-person connection, that person-to-person, that individual capability. And we see this often happen through training and through ERGs. Now, about 10 years ago, and probably earlier than that, when I saw what L&D was doing in this space, it started out with this raising awareness of cultural differences. There was a lot of models around multiculturalism at this time. And I remember almost 10 years ago, I was in a training in my corporation, an 8-hour training on how to work with Indian people. Now, I'm Indian, and I was sitting there in this training, and I was like, okay, well, I'm learning a little bit of new stuff. I hope everyone else is too. And it was really targeted at raising awareness of those cultural differences. Of course, since then, things have evolved, right? We've learned a lot about neuroscience, and we're continuing to find ways to include that in our capability development. And so now we're seeing a lot of things around unconscious bias as an example, but we're really thinking about what are those processes that lead to discrimination and exclusion. And of course, there's things not mentioned in this list that we're doing, right? We're also looking at systemically, how can we provide support and safe spaces and create that psychological safety? Because it's not just all about training, right? There's systems behind this that might reinforce exclusion or inequities in an organization. But here's my question. Once an event is done, then what? And this is where, to me, the intersection between L&D and DEI really needs to start, head, keep moving. Wherever you are in this journey, what are we doing after that event is done, after that training is done, after that safe space dialogue is done? When we talk about learning and development, historically, we have focused on a program or a set of videos. It's a moment in time. When you look at some of our other capabilities, and we're struggling with this in DEI, when you look at things like organization development, when you look at change and you look at transformation, that's really where we're headed with equity and inclusion, is we need to build a capability, an organization-wide capability that's about embedded transformative change. So part of that is a capability building component, and then the other part, again, is about evolving the systems and processes. So let's talk more about that building capability aspect, and how L&D can move from an event type or program type of mindset to more of that journey around transformative change. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the model that myself and a colleague have created. We just published a book about it, and I'm going to walk through a few of the pieces that specifically pertain to DEI, and then I'm going to open up for questions from y'all. And know that what we've developed, it's something that we started working on 5 years ago when ATD, the Association for Talent Development, asked me to design a training on modern learning, on modern learners. They didn't realize that I wasn't just going to give them an L&D course on how to design for millennials, because that's honestly what they were thinking in the moment. I wanted to look at, what does modern learning really mean? So my colleague and I got together 5 years ago, and we started really looking at this question. We started noticing, what are all of the things that have changed, again, as we move from the industrial age to the digital age? And if we were designing L&D from this point with the assumptions of today rather than yesterday, what would we do differently? What would modern learning really look like? And we came up with something that moves us beyond that event programmatic focus. And that's, again, where I'm seeing equity and inclusion and L&D really start to intersect, is we need to build organizational capability over time, not just in that programmatic way. So here's the model we developed. It's called the Learning Cluster Design Model. And it's a model because it's both a philosophy and a process, meaning that there's a way of thinking that supports this model and a way of doing. The way of doing is outlined by 5 actions, and that's what you're seeing in the image there. The change on the job behavior action, learn learner to learner differences, upgrade existing assets, surround learners with meaningful learning assets, and then finally track transformation of everyone's results. One thing I'll note, right when you see those names, you might say, wow, that doesn't sound all that different from where we were. And that's because we know when we want to make a change, if something is too brand new, too far away, we also have a hard time adopting it. So we wanted to really build on L&D's existing talents and wheelhouse of things like setting great objectives, thinking about our audience, designing really well-informed curriculums and measures, and then really elevate and build on those skills for something new. And that something new is defined by our underlying way of thinking. So the way of thinking is really centering around the 4 principles, and you see those on the bottom of the screen there. The 4 principles outline a new job for L&D, a new goal for us in L&D. In the past, historically, just where we've been, again, based on our context of where L&D started, our goal essentially was to create a training or create a single learning asset. We call those learning assets. When you have a training, a program, a set of videos. What we realized is, in order to go beyond one and done, given a particular capability gap, we need to design more than one learning asset. We need to go beyond that single program and actually surround our learners with meaningful learning assets. So this model's goal right from the outset is about designing more than one thing, given any particular business capability challenge. The second big way of thinking is that we want to target changing on the job behavior. When we look at our historic focus, because we didn't necessarily have the technology yet, we couldn't meet the learner where they're at on the job. And so it was a black box. What happens after the classroom? What happens after the e-learning? What happens after they watch those videos? Our goal is to change on the job behavior. And again, because we're creating a set of meaningful learning assets across the journey, across the flow of work for learners, we think we can get there. We want to focus on diverse learner contexts. Another thing we found really important with the digital age is diversity. We are no longer limited to just serving a single target audience. We believe that because of technology, we have efficiencies and scale we can leverage in order to meet the needs of diverse learners. And then the last piece is designing the whole, not just the parts. As we get into modern learning, a lot of folks are thinking about more than one asset. They might be designing blended learning. They might be designing a set of videos here, a classroom training here, a social learning experience here. But thinking about how all those pieces work together and aren't just designed separately, having those pieces have an anchor, a core piece that they're really going after, that's what's different with the LCD model. So I want to share about the learning product, the end thing. So I keep saying a set of learning assets. We call that learning product a learning cluster. So rather than delivering a training or videos, a course, class, or program, we believe L&D's job is to deliver learning clusters. And this is, again, that set of meaningful, organized, intentional assets. These organized intentional assets, they go in and out of the flow of work. They support when, where, and how learners need to learn. So the example you're seeing there on the side is, it's really actually an example for me. I needed to learn French. I was going to France, and I was going to France for a month, and I knew I would need to speak the language. And so when I tried to learn, and as many modern learners do, I tried a variety of learning assets. Before the trip, I was using apps. I was using YouTube. I was trying to speak French with my friends and family. And then when I got to France, I had different ways I was learning as well. In the moment, as I was in cafes, I was hearing people speak, and I was working on, hey, how can I sound a little bit more like them? And when I ran into a problem, I had my Google Translate app, I had my Rick Steves phrasebook. What I think about is, how does that learning experience line up? How does that capability experience line up to what we offer in the workplace? So imagine if employees had this cohesive set of assets that they could choose. They don't necessarily need to use all of them. Everyone doesn't need to use everything. But it's been designed for the diversity of learners based on when we think they most likely will need to learn and in which ways they might prefer. So that's really what we're aiming for with the model. Who is this model for? As I mentioned, when ATD first approached me, they were thinking, okay, this is going to be training about how L&D can keep up with millennials and Gen Z and their needs in L&D. And the more I looked at generational learning styles, to be honest, the less convinced I became. And again, I'm open to folks emailing me and making the case for generational learning styles. Feel free. I would love to see more and more data and more insights and perspective on that. For me, what was important about generations was a couple things. One is that we have a huge demographic shift going on. So again, even as we think about DEI, we've got to think about how people flow in and out of organizations, and how building inclusion capability and equity is an ongoing journey. we're always going to be introducing folks to building this inclusive capability. And we're going to be seeing this shift. And L&D needs to be a part of that knowledge transfer, that culture transfer. So we started defining who a modern learner is, because when we asked this question, there really wasn't a common response. So some people, when we asked them to imagine a modern learner, they did automatically imagine a millennial or imagine someone who's really into technology. What we started doing was really surveying people on this question. And this is the definition we came up with. It's someone who needs to learn fast in an ever-changing environment, who will access a wide variety of resources to get answers. Now there's two pieces to this. One is the external environment they're in, and the other is their internal mindset. So oftentimes I try to understand definitions by who is not a part of that. It's not just all millennials by default, I've already said that. It's not just people who are using the latest technology. As we move from industrial age thinking to digital age, it's about choices. So it's someone who's looking for the right learning source or avenue based on their context or their situation or their need. In some cases, that might be a classroom training. In other cases, that might be a face-to-face conversation. And in some, it might just be a quick Google search. We say that it's not someone with a fixed mindset. So it's someone, again, with that internal mindset. We've seen a lot of research lately about the motivation around learning. And so we talk a lot more about the growth mindset. Doesn't mean that someone can't shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset and become that modern learner. And then this last one, someone who's in a relatively unchanging business. This is about the very few organizations we come across where that one and done event is enough. And frankly, in the DEI context, I don't think we'd ever see this because, again, the DEI is something you live every day, in my perspective. So I'm going to focus on 3 actions in particular out of the model that empower DEI efforts. The change action. This is where we really set the objective for the entire learning cluster. And what we're doing in this objective setting goal is not focusing on, at the end of this class, you'll be able to, or at the end of this speaking engagement, you'll be able to. You still do that, but you do it later. What we're interested in is, again, that changing on the job behavior principle we have. So we focus our goal on the driving business need and its link to on-the-job behaviors we want to see. And I'll give you an example in a little bit. The learn action. This is huge when we're thinking about DEI, because this is about audience understanding. Whether you're delivering a DEI effort or you're just trying to become more inclusive throughout any L&D program, this is where we're moving from just focusing on one target audience to really identifying and understanding the learner personas that really contribute to that change on the job behavior goal. And then the third action I'll focus on is the surround action. And that's really the heart of the model. This is really where we're choosing, where we're deciding learning assets that really are speaking to those diverse learner personas and land across that flow of work. And so this is where we really start to strategically look at transformation beyond that one and done. So let me give you an example of what this looks like, and then I will give you some D&I specific notes if you are leading a DEI initiative. So this example, when you look at it, think of this as if you were doing any L&D initiative and you'd like to apply the LCD model, these are some of the outputs you would see. This particular example, the topic is for a innovation training, an innovation capability initiative. So here's how the goal of a learning cluster sounds. Think about how a traditional L&D program goal sounds, okay? And that's what I want you to notice is the difference. By growing innovation capability in experienced talent, the business will drive scale, efficiency, and new revenue growth. On the job, we will see talent naming and leading new initiatives that explore or pilot new ideas. Justify and influence investments in areas historically perceived as risky. Curate and collaborate on innovative ideas together. So these are a couple of on-the-job behaviors that stakeholders might be interested in. And that's really where we get these on-the-job behaviors. And we're really trying to focus on what's important now in this initiative. We might come back to this a year from now and say, hey, you know, we've gotten better on innovation capability. Now we want to do innovation capability 2.0 and name some other behaviors. Take a look at the learn action output. At first, and this is actually a real example, by the way. At first, with this innovation capability, the business just said, hey, we just want tenured folks and leaders to be the focus of this work. But after actually interviewing learners, here's what we landed with. We learned and uncovered a persona we named Siloed Shaker. Okay, Siloed Shaker was somebody who he would love to be building his innovation capability, but he's just focused on his function and his knowledge and his relationships right there in his role. And so couldn't get those sparks going for innovative, to really drive those innovative ideas he might have. Day-to-day Darren. Day-to-day Darren was a manager, kind of note that these are personas, right? So I'm describing a generic story. Day-to-day Darren was a manager who's really focused on day-to-day fires and ended up always getting stuck in the tactical pieces, as we often see managers do. And he or she didn't have the capacity to work on the strategic pieces that would then lead him to have those innovative sparks. And then we had a third persona we called Big Picture Betty. This was someone who we saw as almost a champion or a role model for innovation capability. This was someone who had cross-company networks, really was constantly focusing on the big picture, sometimes at the expense of the day-to-day tactical. So these are some of our interesting personas, and it led to a particular learning cluster. So as we thought about Siloed Shaker, Day-to-day Darren, Big Picture Betty, we realized, wow, we really want to do some formal learning on innovation and leading innovation programs and building innovative capability. But then everything else we wanted to do had much more to do with social learning, had much more to do with, as these folks are fighting day-to-day fires, what can they have that's immediately available to them that they could do in short stints rather than having to spend, you know, a half a day or even an hour in a formal type of session. So I'm going to keep moving, but hopefully that gives you a good concept of what a learning cluster looks like. And again, I just want to give you time to have some questions too. So I'm going to keep going with what the change action might look like for DEI. Here's what I've noticed, and especially recently, is that organizations are struggling to operationalize DEI on a day-to-day level. We often stay up here philosophically where we would like to be, or philosophically what is DEI, and then we struggle to define what does the day-to-day actually mean in our talent. The change action, each of these actions has a template that goes with it. It provides a process to create deeper, more anchoring notions for what is it that we're trying to achieve with this capability in this organization, in this moment of time that we're in the context we're in. So some of the kinds of questions you might ask during this action to identify some of those ROIs and especially those on-the-job behaviors. Beyond gaining awareness and education, how might people show up and act differently? What do we hope to see? What are we seeing right now when people show up in their teams and show up in their communities? What are the on-the-job and business goals? What is our arc for capability to grow leader? So really doing an assessment and understanding where are we at now? And so what is the capability to focus on now so we understand where we want to grow in the future? brought this up earlier. Are we focusing on the D, the E, or the I, right? What aspect of this are we focusing on now? And same question, what kinds of on-the-job behaviors would it look like if folks were behaving in a more equitable fashion? And again, as you ask these questions, some of it you might find are capability things you could do. And you might also uncover, wow, this is not about capability, but this is about a system or a process we need to change. And then maybe it starts to move out of the L&D purview. What behaviors can be developed via, well, that's what I just said, via capability building versus other organizational levers. So the change action really helps create those deeper, more anchoring notions. It really pushes people to get more granular on that operationalizing piece and provides a process to do that. Let's take a look at the learn action in DEI. Here's again what I'm seeing with DEI, and especially this year, this is a lot of what I've been hearing, is that folks are feeling frustrated about joining, oftentimes being mandated to join into an effort when they might be in a completely different place on their DEI journey rather than someone else. So we have these kind of one-size-fits-all approaches. And what the learn action does is it helps provide a process to name, define, and explore the needs of different constituencies in your organization and where they are. So some examples of that, let me just bring them all up. You might have folks who are brand new to considering differences. No blame or shame or in that, but there are folks who are in that realm, right? There might be folks who are capacity overloaded, and they just, like our innovation capability example, they're so stuck in the day-to-day, they just don't have the capacity to consider the softer side of their relationships and how they are building or developing their teams or showing up in relationships. You might have folks who are highly aware of things. Maybe they participate in a lot of education already on their own or through the organization, and they're ready for action. You might have folks who are located in regions that have little opportunity to engage, at least from their perception, in DEI efforts. These are just some very high-level generic examples. Every organization I've talked to, they're in different places with DEI, so please don't take these and copy and paste them. I just wanted to create some concept, some kind of example for you to potentially envision in your organization. But a lot of times you will find when you do the change action work, say you're really focused on the E, around equity. When you get to this learn action, your learner personas are going to be tied into those on-the-job behaviors you define in the E. And again, the model helps walk you through how to make those connections and linkages. Lastly, before I start to move into questions, the surround action. I am not at all trying to minimize the incredible challenge and complexity and hard work we're all doing, both in DEI and in L&D. There is a lot we take on. And I don't want anyone out of this to feel like I don't acknowledge or value or recognize that. And at the same time, I am so passionate about this area. I have to ask, is it enough? And we're all asking this question in one way or the other. This is where we really start to move from training, that event-based, maybe safe space or listening session, and even our strategic sessions our leaders are often engaged in. And we really start to say, how do we grow people's capability, not just in the moment, but in all the different moments they are most likely to run into DEI needs. And so we might ask, what problems are the various personas we came up with most likely to encounter? So if I think about capacity overloaded person, right? They might be in a meeting and accidentally say something just because they didn't have the capacity. That's a problem they might encounter. How might I support someone who might have made that faux pas in that moment as an L&D person trying to build organizational capability? What will they use when they run into a problem? Who or what do these personas turn to first or most often when they have a need? we want to build on that and help make sure that those avenues are quality, because yes, we have a lot of choices today, but we have a lot of choices today. And you don't want your employees having to hunt through all those choices all the time. And L&D can play a really big role in making sure that there's quality experiences out there. And what assets are needed to achieve the specific on-the-job behaviors we outlined at the beginning. So we usually coach organizations for a particular learning cluster to have about 5 to 10 assets. No more than that, because it gets quite a bit tough to manage at that point. But this 5 to 10, you can really go beyond the moment and surround your learners with a meaningful strategic set, especially having done the learner persona work and the change work. So to sum this up, traditional and even the more modern L&D models, we benchmarked around 30 L&D models as we were writing the book to see where we're distinct, where we're building, who we're building on, and all of those types of questions. So here's what we found. Traditionally, even more L&D models, they assume L&D's job is to create a single learning asset, a learning course, program, whatnot, a learning deliverable. And this is just a kind of a baked in presumption. It's not intentional, right? It's just where we started from, and we've kind of continued down that space. They usually aren't designed for more than one target audience. They aren't usually designed to deliver business impact. It's usually designed to deliver end of class or end of asset objectives. Not for lack of trying. We do try to understand the business need. It just, we might not necessarily have the confidence of being able to deliver on that need, because everything is kind of a black box after someone's experienced that single learning asset. And then the most modern L&D models, I see them trying new technologies or tools, or focusing on user experience, for example, with design thinking models, but it doesn't link them together with that cohesive strategy of what are we trying to change on the job. With DEI, I see that this is going to require multiple, many, I don't know how to say many, complex pieces in order to lead to transformative change. In our approach to transformative change, I believe we need to role model including difference. And right now, I'm too often seeing the one-size-fits-all approach. As much as I know, again, that it's a very challenging goal we all are taking on in this space. And I see that we need to move out of the classroom or events into the flow of work and really understand who is the population we're trying to impact and where are they at in their DEI journeys. How can we support them in that? And now we're not going to be able to get down to the granular each individual person and where they're at. But just by moving from a single target audience to a handful of personas gets you closer than where we were before. And that's my goal here, is making a difference. Okay, I'm not, even in the summary, I'm not trying to say we have the 100% solution to everything and it's going to be perfect. Again, this is definitely an emerging piece. And this is what we're hoping to address and move forward with, move the needle on. So these are just a couple of ways that you can get more involved with the LCD model. We have some virtual workshops we do in which you can actually bring your initiative to the workshop. And by the end of it, we have you actually building a learning cluster. You build a learning cluster by the end of it. So we have one coming up in October and one in November. I didn't tell this to Renee, but I'm actually doing a free book raffle for y'all. So if you're interested in reading Designing for Modern Learning, where we go into the deep details on the model, just feel free to drop your email there. I don't know if I'll have the moment to announce the winner at the end, but I will make sure to get that to you. And my colleague Lisa Owens is going to be doing a deeper dive from an L&D perspective. So I know I'm probably really short on time because I just looked at my watch, so I might have been getting angry chats from Renee, although I can't imagine angry chats. But I'm going to stop talking and I've got to open up chats to see what's going on here. But yes, I will open up for some questions. And I know that was a lot to take in. So
At this point, you're welcome to either put your questions in the chat or you are welcome to unmic.
Hey, Crystal, I think that was a great presentation. It was different than a lot of the traditional learning and development presentations you have, more in the realm of systems thinking. How are people reacting to having a bigger strategy picture for deploying some of these ideas?
great question. Immediately, two reactions come to mind. From an organizational standpoint, so L&D stakeholders and leaders, extremely positive response. All of this feels very intuitive to people outside of L&D, and they're hungry for it. Inside of L&D, the biggest reaction is, besides the possibility of what all of this could achieve, it's the concern around capacity, right? So the idea of now building multiple assets for one capability gap rather than I've developed my class and I'm good, or I've developed my videos and I'm good. And a big part of the shift in thinking there is we were also forced to kind of cram everything into that class or that set of videos or that e-learning. Now we're just taking those and we're often chunking those out into different assets for different moments of learning need for different personas. So oftentimes there's a lot of reusing, repurposing that actually comes along in the realm of building a learning cluster. So I usually get that reaction from L&D, and then we get a calming moment. It's okay, we can do this, and the process really helps with that. Great question.
I have another one if you don't mind.
Go for it.
There's a lot of talk in the field about evaluating the impact of learning, and so people are chasing after the Kirkpatrick model and other kinds of things. But the logic of your approach is that most of those things that are going to be impactful aren't directly associated from the class. They're on the follow-on actions that people implement. So do you even try to assess the impact? Is it worth the benefit in most cases, or because there are multiple impact sources,
Yeah.
not just the class?
Absolutely. So we do. So in our track transformation piece, so this is a really emerging area, and one of the places I would love to have partnership in the future is folks who are really into big data and analysis around this, because we are talking about trying to measure a combinatorial effect, right? And again, when everyone is not expected to use every single asset. So one of the things we talk about in track transformation is that usage and reaction to each asset isn't really as powerful as knowing the overall ROI and KPIs and on-the-job target at the beginning. Being able to put in some metrics in place for those, that really helps you track the impact of the overall learning cluster. So we're almost looking at individual assets to help tell the story of the impact, but not necessarily looking at each individual asset and trying to connect the impact back to an on-the-job behavior or KPI. We're just tracking those KPIs and on-the-job behaviors and having greater confidence that because we have multiple assets, the learning cluster is having its intended effect. So it's definitely that is probably one of the most emerging parts of the research around this model, is how do you measure the combinatorial impact? Because measuring the impact of one asset, that already was, wow, well, it's a big black box after that. So how do we know? This, we feel a little bit greater confidence that we know, and yet still you might want something more granular or statistically valid to help with that. So another really great question.
Yeah.
And on that note, that brings us to time. For those of you who have joined us, we would like to thank you for joining us for ISPI SoCal. Invite you to future events. So if you go to ispi.org SoCal. We'll share our screen really quickly here so that you can see what that looks like. You'll be able to see other events that we have. And so we have a number of other speakers coming up. Again, we hope to see you soon. And Crystal, thank you once again.